Hello, everybody. I'm very much looking forward to talking to you about this topic, diversity in the technology industry. It's doing the research for this topic's been incredibly eye-opening for me, because I've spent probably, I don't know, the last 6 years thinking, yay, PensionBee is doing a really good job from a diversity perspective. And it's been such an eye-opening experience, understanding how far we have yet to go, even though we have come some distance. And it's also made me realize how I spent certainly the first half of my career immersed in the least diverse pool of people possible, because the tech industry, as you're going to see, very much makes it easy to be in that environment. So without further ado, let me share my screen. Okay, so diversity can be a bit of a heavy topic, so I'm going to try and introduce this through something that is not a heavy topic, and that's emojis. So you may have used or seen this emoji. This is the runner. This was introduced in 2010, but emojis actually date back to the 1980s and came out of Japan. Emoji, emotion character, for the Japanophiles amongst you. Notice how this is a man. Emojis are almost always male. This is the woman running emoji. We have these in Slack, I think. And these days we have emojis for all shades of skin colors, and for male and for female. But the woman running emoji, when do you suppose this was brought into existence? Any guesses? 2018, 2012. Okay, so you're taking the pessimistic viewpoint, which is appropriate, because this was not introduced until 2016. And you might say, well, why? Why was there 6 years in between the introduction of the male emoji and the female emoji? So there's this international consortium called the Unicode Emoji Subcommittee, which is a subcommittee of the organization that looks after all of our fonts, essentially, our characters that go into fonts on the internet, which is Unicode. And what they did in 2016, which was long overdue, but quite sort of symbolic in the internet community, was they introduced female gender emojis for all of those emojis that didn't have female equivalents. And they also introduced a lot of extra skin tones at that point. And this was seen as a really significant moment in the tech industry waking up and realizing that not every person in the tech industry and beyond using the things that the tech industry is producing is a white male. So this is my attempt to slightly, lighten the atmosphere around diversity, because it's not always, well, as you're about to see, I'm going to jump into some stuff that's slightly more serious, more impactful on people's lives than just emojis. Although, to be fair, emojis are pretty impactful. Okay, so the structure of this talk's essentially twofold. I want to go over why diversity and inclusion in the technology industry is a problem. And we do a lot of talks and reflection about diversity and inclusion. So I'm going to try and narrow it down to why it's also a problem in the technology industry in some sort of weird and wonderful and unique ways. And then also look at what we can do about that and what we are doing about that. So just to start off on a personal note, for me, I think diversity and inclusion is just the right thing to do all the time. I think the lack of equality of opportunity is a moral imperative for a just society. And so for me, I don't need any further reason to want to pursue it. But when you look into it, there are all sorts of reasons. I think for us as a business, there's also an economic imperative for businesses and also for economies to look for this equality of opportunity. I think, again, taking it to the technology industry, it's about creating better products and services for people that use the output of this industry, as well as making people who work in it essentially happier and have better livelihoods. Okay, so what do we mean by diversity and inclusion as a problem in the technology industry? So there's a few aspects to this. We need to have a diverse range of people creating the products and services that people use, because they're used universally around the world, and that is the most diverse audience you can imagine. We also, for people working in the industry, we want a sustainable flow of talent into the industry, because it's forever growing, and if we can't make sure that tomorrow's developers are going to appear at our door ready to work on our problems, then it's, there's going to be bottlenecks, and that's going to create its own problems. And then it's also another aspect of this is how people are treated and the experience that they have as employees and workers within the technology industry and within companies like ours. So let's start with products and services. So what happens when products and services are not designed by a diverse range of people? So I said I was going to get heavy. Car safety is one that pops up all the time. It's amazing that as late as 2019, there was a study that showed that females in cars are going to be injured statistically more frequently in a car crash than males, because the sort of safety measures of vehicles are not designed for women's different average size, and things like seat belts are not designed for people with breasts. So it's not great. I wasn't expecting this one to pop up, but it's quite serious. Moving on to another not exactly light topic: facial recognition technology. Facial recognition technology is a type of artificial intelligence, and a lot of artificial intelligence is trained on very large data sets in order to get good at what it does. And unfortunately, if you train a facial recognition algorithm on a lot of white male faces, if you have over representation of those in your sample, it's going to get very good at detecting white male faces and not very good at detecting the faces that you put in your sample at not the same level of representation. So last year, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, reported that Amazon, IBM, Microsoft, they'd all stopped or paused their facial recognition software sales to police in the United States because of reports, research showing that it was statistically much worse at recognizing particularly Black female faces, and this would cause people to be even arrested because the facial recognition technology thought that they were somebody else, and that's obviously incredibly devastating for people who are affected in this way. VR. I don't know if anybody's used a VR headset, but it can make you nauseous at the best of times. However, it can make women even more nauseous, because, believe it or not, a lot of people working in VR are men, and they build the headsets to fit on male heads, which are typically bigger than female heads. And therefore, what's really interesting is that in order to avoid the feeling of nausea, you need the eye sockets or whatever of the headset to line up with your eyes, and you twist a little thing on the headset to adjust it. And for 90% of women, their eyes are closer together than the default setting on the VR headset. And amazingly, nearly a third of women have eyes that will not fit comfortably line up with one of these with the eye sockets on one of these headsets, which is just incredible. And it goes on, and it made me think, What about age? It's not something that I read a lot about in the research, but we're a pension company and we design products for people who are getting on in life a lot of the time. We hear and stand up every day. I think it was 30% of our acquisition yesterday nearly was over 50. And I thought, well, whilst we do have some people over 50 in the company, I don't think we have anybody who is over 55. So what does that say about our ability to design the best online pension when nobody in our company can actually use that part of it? Okay, so our industry, the technology industry, how does that do at attracting and retaining talent? Well, let's look at attracting first of all. I've got a rather long quote for you, which I'll read out because I think it's really good. And it's from Dr. Marianne Blatters, a senior researcher at the Bridge Group. So she says, unlike other professions where it is obvious what you need to study, e.g. to become a doctor, you study medicine, the pathway to a career in tech is often unclear, haphazard, and informed by popular/media discourses. As a result, those who are in the know have better chances of accessing tech roles and have greater awareness of the range of careers which exist in tech. So far, the focus has largely been on getting more women into tech. However, socioeconomic background, ethnicity, age, disability, and other diversity characteristics may also come into play. An exclusive focus on gender means additional challenges may be overlooked. Intersectionality matters. And I thought this was great because I know exactly what she's talking about in terms of how people's journeys into working in a tech role can seem really random, really non-traditional, I suppose. Certainly my journey into tech was like that. I don't have a GCSE in IT. I didn't study computer science, or I didn't get a computer science degree. I thought I was going to work in marketing to begin with. So I think that there are lots of people that work at PensionBee in tech as well who've switched careers. And that's quite unusual, really. And it is a bit of an ongoing problem. And then this point about intersectionality, or rather just not just focusing on getting more women into tech, because there is a lot of effort to get women into tech when you look at the sites and the movements that are out there. I think understanding that actually other diversity is important, like people from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, people from different ages. It's all really, really relevant. So a little bit of anecdotal evidence. This is a friend of mine. This is Omar. So Omar grew up in Croydon in South London, and I met him when he was a teenager, and he was an international athlete representing England as a discus thrower and as a sprinter. He is currently working as the CTO at Alina, which is a startup aiming to help people overcome social anxiety. And I speak to him on a fairly regular basis, once every few months, because he's a young CTO, and it's nice to talk to him about some of the experience that I've had. But I met him when he was 16, a program called Young Rewired State. And for those of you who have not heard of it, and I imagine that's most of you, Young Rewired State happened every year for a few years, and it brought together groups of young people around the country, and they would spend a couple of weeks embedded in a local company, and they would work in teams that kind of hacking on projects, and they were trying to solve real world problems and make stuff that they thought was interesting. And then at the end of the 2 weeks, we all got on a train and went to Birmingham for the national finals. And it gave these teams of young people this amazing opportunity to be seen and to participate in something. And for a lot of them, it gave them the feeling that actually, this was a really exciting area to be in, and gave them that first taste of working in the technology industry. And some of them, like Omar, went on to do exactly that. So I gave him a ring recently and talked to him about barriers to getting into the tech industry for young Black people. So I wanted to share with you some of the things that he said. So Omar studied computer science at the University of Bath. He's a smart guy. He graduated with first. He's a confident guy when you meet him. He's very aware that he's been told that he's very successful at what he does from an early age because of his athletics background. And so he does have a sense of confidence, which has really helped in his career. What's amazing, though, is what he said about his experiences that he's kind of had to brush off. So he says here about the university. So when you go there, University of Bath's in the Russell Group, so it's top 20 universities. And he said there's basically not very many Black people. He said, you want to fit in, you may need to change the way that you talk, move slower so people don't get jumpy, which I just can't imagine. But this is what he said. You're the sole representative of your race, so this is a source of anxiety. And he described university having a whitening effect on some of the people that he knew. They wanted to whiten themselves from a behavioral perspective and from an appearance perspective in order to fit in with their peers. He described interviewing for a spring internship at Nomura, which is a bank. He did the interview with a database engineer and got the feedback, you sound a bit rough around the edges, and they didn't go on to get the internship. He did get an internship at a financial services company and got a series of roles from there before he ended up joining the startup that he's in now. On working in technology, he said, no one in the industry looks like you. No one talks like you. He did say it's important to see Black people in a high position. It's important for people to be their authentic self in that high position, he means. And then to give an example of what he means about being your authentic self, he talked about the way that Black people that he knows will adjust their voices to have a work voice. There's my sister, and his sister works at Kingston University and in diversity work. My sister has a different voice for talking to people at work. And then he talked about his own experience. When somebody rang from Google, someone from Google rang Omar's company and asked to speak to the CTO, they had the whitest voice. But when they realized I was Black, they relaxed and spoke normally, and the caller was Black. And Omar's response to that was to see this as that person carrying a real burden of how they felt they had to behave. He did have some positives to say about the tech industry, tech being quite meritocratic and less about building relationships and how you sound, which I thought was good. I asked him what he thought could help, and he said role models are important. And people in companies need to recognize the importance of being in hiring roles. You might have a better team because it's more diverse. And I don't think we would doubt that. And that hiring managers need to recognize their own biases before they inject it into their hiring process. As I said, Omar represented England as a discus thrower and as a sprinter. He described this as being independent validation. So he never felt the need to change, which I think is much to his credit. He also commented at the end that getting to people whilst they're still young really helps, which kind of got us talking about younger wide state and whether that had a benefit on him. So anecdotal evidence is great, and talking to Omar was very eye-opening, but it's important to try and look at the data en masse. And we're fortunate that in the UK there have been a number of quite broad studies into diversity. It's mainly in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths. But there's also sort of tech-focused diversity studies as well. So I had a look at some stats from these two reports. This one on the left is the all-party parliamentary group on diversity and inclusion in STEM. So that was people drawn from all the different political parties, the idea being that this is a universal concern. So here's some interesting stats. From a gender perspective, 80% of the tech industry is male versus 50% for the rest of the workforce. And amazingly, only 5% of leadership position holders in tech are women. From an ethnicity point of view, tech is 84% white versus 88% for the rest of the workforce. Remember, this is across the whole of the UK. That's suggesting that tech's actually more diverse from an ethnicity point of view than the average. But what's overrepresented here is the number of Asian and Asian British people, and Black people are really underrepresented. From a disability perspective, tech's a little bit less, a little bit lower here than the rest of the workforce. And then what's also interesting from the data was age. I thought this was going to be massively overrepresented at the sort of 20 to 29 level. But it's actually the sort of middle age that's really overrepresented. And particularly people who are 50 plus are significantly underrepresented. So that also presents a problem if we wanted to do something around finding slightly older people to work in our tech team. It's actually very hard to get data on sexual orientation and on neurodiversity in tech, which is partly because the government doesn't sort of mandate the collection of that information. One of the recommendations from that all-party parliamentary group was that the government puts more of these characteristics, these diversity characteristics, into its legislation about what companies needed to collect and report on. So that's all about attraction and the stats of people who are in the industry. I just want to say a few words on retention. This is a quote from a book that Priel told me about recently. And it looks like a great book. Well, I've not had the chance to read too much of it yet, but it's all about a world that's not being built for women, essentially. And there's this quote from close to the beginning. More than 40% of women leave tech companies after 10 years, compared to 17% of men. A report by the Center for Talent Innovation found that women didn't leave for family reasons or because they didn't enjoy the work. They left because of workplace conditions, undermining behavior from managers, and a sense of feeling stalled in one's career. So I think this is good anecdotal evidence for a sort of all the reports of programmer culture that have been in and out of the press over the last couple of years. So how do we begin to tackle all of these problems? There is no silver bullet, as we know from the rest of our diversity studies, but there are things that you can do. And the Tech Talent Charter, which I'll say a little bit more about later, recommends this sort of 3-step process as your best practice for your own company. And this very much mirrors what we've done, across the whole company, really. Collecting the data on your company, using that baseline and the best practice that you can find to develop a strategy, and then making sure that you measure your progress, but also champion your successes. So stage 1 is collecting the data. I'm not going to dwell too much on this table of numbers. We've all seen and heard our diversity and inclusion survey results before, but I just wanted to put on here, pull out the technology team as a separate column because it is interesting. One thing that makes this so much easier for me and for everybody else who's been analyzing the data is that there's been a big increase in the number of people responding to the survey compared to Q4 in 2020 when we did it before. And I just do want to say thank you again, because it does make the job of understanding where we're at so much easier when people participate. So yeah, with the technology team, you can see here, it's a little bit different in some places to PensionBee as a whole. In some other places, it's similar. And I'll come back to some of this shortly. So from the data, we need to develop a strategy. Any good strategy starts with setting our targets. And this is not news, but PensionBee has in its diversity and inclusion policy these targets for the company as a whole for 2022, maintaining at least 50% of women and minority gender balance at all levels in the company, and increasing the representation of all ethnic minorities to at least match the UK population, again, across all levels of the business. We don't have separate targets as a technology team, but whilst I was putting this together, it occurred to me, why would we? And I think that, you know, one of our values is simplicity, and I think it's easiest and most simple for us all to target the same things, especially with people moving in and out of different teams. And so I think it's entirely appropriate for us as a company to aspire to these targets, you know, in all sorts of different departments. And whilst I can't speak, whilst I can't put words in Jasper's mouth, for example, I can certainly say, I think it's appropriate to aspire to these targets in tech. So what gets measured gets managed, and, you know, targets are fine, but how are people being, you know, how are people being held accountable? The recent changes to performance management have obviously been at the forefront of people's minds. The senior management team, all of their performance metrics that they're measured on, we all have an entry around diversity and inclusion, engagement with the initiatives and promoting diversity inclusion within the company and outside the company. And on everybody's performance matrix, there is a line which encourages us at the very least to engage with the D&I program. So I just want to step through a few things that are tangible activities that are happening or have been happening for a while inside the tech team that relate to diversity and inclusion. Some of these are not new. Some of these are quite old. So recruitment within tech has always focused on non-traditional channels. And that's partly because when the company started, we were trying to conserve cash as much as we possibly could. And hiring senior developers with 10 years of experience was and is a very expensive proposition at the moment, given where we are with the UK's skill shortages. So we focused on different channels, and something that's been really successful for us is career switches. So people have come to us through training academies like Makers Academy and General Assembly. We've also done a lot of work to support people through internal transitions, often from the A team, and a large proportion of our tech team today have come through that route. We've also always been open to regional diversity. So I would say probably most people in the tech team, at least initially, started off working in the London office, but we've always supported people if they wanted to move their lives to different parts of the UK or, you know, different parts of the world. And then the interview process, something that is quite nice about tech is that you can generally tell if people are good at it, because you can give them some, you know, job specific tests and see how they do. So we've never screened for people's degrees or their educational background at all. We do use job specific skill-based assessments. So for example, we give people coding exercises to do. And we use structured interviews. So we go in with a set of questions that we're expecting everybody who's interviewing to ask. Recently, we've started to talk about cultural contribution in the hiring process, not cultural fit. Cultural fit was, well, cultural contribution, this is a Simon Sinek idea, because if you talk about cultural fit, then you talk about how are people like me, essentially. And it can be a veneer for all sorts of unconscious bias. Whereas if you use the phrase cultural contribution, then you're actually looking for what is different about people and what are they bringing that other people don't already have. And I thought that was great when I heard that, and you know, starting to use that in the hiring process, it really changes your frame of mind when you're sort of thinking about that aspect of the gut feeling. Flexible working. I mean, we're all flexibly working at the moment, but I think it's important to recognize that by being open to hiring people who are not and never will be in London, that encourages people from all around the country to apply. It's also important to support flexible working when attracting parents. Code Club is something that we've done in various different forms over the years, and it's supported people both to develop skills, and in some cases that's led to them taking up a place in the tech team. But in other cases, it's just about building confidence with technology. And I like to talk about as having a high level of technology literacy within the company. I think it's really important that we're all really comfortable using the technology that we have every day, because if we're comfortable, then we'll have better ideas about how to improve it. Changing our vocabulary, that's something that we've done quite recently in the tech team. So in operations, for example, we've stopped using terms like white lists and black lists, and we use red, amber, green lists. In the tech team, a long-standing kind of technical concept is around having a master object and a slave object, and it's goes back to kind of databases and things. But you don't, you happily use that terminology and never think about it. But I think over the last, certainly year and a half, 2 years, tech companies and tech projects have done a lot of work to reflect on their own vocabulary. So our code repositories, they used to all have master branches, and sometimes you'd hear in stand-up or in product updates, oh, we're pushing this thing to master, and that's all changed. So they're all called main. It's just shifting away from that kind of terminology. One last thing to talk about is time to talk, which is something that Devinder set up, which is effectively I guess a safe space for PensionBee's women in tech, and allows for kind of storytelling and role modeling, and was really organic the way that was set up. And it's really nice to see that there's both the enthusiasm to create that within the company and the enthusiasm to attend. And then one other thing that we've done recently that I'm really proud of is we signed up to the Tech Talent Charter. So we did this last month in October, and just got in before their deadline for data reporting for this year. But we're sitting now on their website along around 600 other signatories, and it's a commitment to adopting certain practices to increase diversity and inclusion in the tech industry. So our 4 commitments is that it has to be an executive sponsor, which is me. We have to have a plan, and this is part of the plan. We also have to collaborate with other signatories, and they offer things like there are virtual events. They do hack days around trying to kind of get different people with different perspectives to sort of share their best practice, and companies just to share stories about what's worked well for them and what hasn't worked well. So I'm hoping we're going to start doing some of that soon. And then contributing data, which goes into their annual report on the state of the tech industry, which is one of the 2 reports that I showed a picture of earlier. And although at the moment they're only collecting gender and ethnicity data just on the makeup of your teams, they're doing that because they can't get companies to disclose information at a sufficient level around all the other diversity characteristics. So that's something that they're really working on. Okay, so that's the strategy. The last step in the not quite silver bullet approach was that you have to measure how you're doing. Otherwise, how will you know? And also champion your successes. But I think there is a lot to celebrate. And this came back to, my several years of kind of naivety of thinking, oh yeah, we're doing a great job here. But there is a lot to celebrate, and we have come some distance, even though we have to recognize that there is still distance to go. And I think that the statistic that keeps coming back to me is something that's just a beacon really is that 92% of the company, of all you guys, girls, said, yes, I would recommend working at PensionBee to a friend. And that's just amazing, and gives me and Romy a huge amount of pride. The other thing about the technology team that I mentioned earlier, so 70% of the team having a non-traditional journey into tech, I think that's something which is remarkable, really, and something that I'm hoping we'll have a chance to talk to some of those 600 Tech Talent Charter signatories about, because I think it's been a fascinating journey to be on. Our gender balance is better than the industry average. I think 50% is very achievable, and I want us to get there, but it's good to know that we are doing a better job than the average. And ethnicity similarly, although I think like the industry in general, we do have an underrepresentation of Black people, and that's something else that we need to work on. And our regional diversity is great. The tech industry and generally R&D as a whole in the country is often talked about as being concentrated in what they call a golden triangle of the southeast. That's London, Oxford, and Cambridge, and it's where a lot of the research and development spending goes on, and that's where, therefore, a lot of the jobs are. So I think it's really good that we've been able to sort of organically build up a team that's based all around the country and even around the world. And then there's the little wins. So we had somebody who was doing a job interview recently, and they were from an ethnic minority, and they said they were attracted by what they'd seen of the diversity of the company, which was great, because that the only way that they would have had to read that is through our external signals, like maybe the awards that we were winning, or the way that we were talking about the team on our own website. But of course, there's always more to do. Michael Dell, a very successful person in the tech industry, has a personal mantra, which is to be pleased, not satisfied. And I think that's a good approach. I think these three areas in particular are areas that we can work on, it, particularly within tech. So neurodiversity, remembering that table of the PensionBee D&I data, 24% of the tech team self-identify as having a neurodiversity, and that's the highest grouping in the company, and much higher than the country at large. And yet we don't understand this as well as we would like to. We don't understand how to support people who are neurodiverse as well as we would like to. And I think that with the highest proportion in the company, I think that the technology team needs to lead the way in supporting and using the neurodiversity as a plus, as well as providing the support where it's necessary. Engagement with Black communities, I think proactive outreach has got to be the way to solve the problem of a talent funnel that needs topping up. And we don't do as well as the rest of the company in this respect. And then socioeconomic diversity. Although the data is very hard to come by in the tech industry as a whole, anecdotal evidence sort of shows that it's not, people from a lower socioeconomic background are not well represented in the industry, nor are they well represented in our own tech team. And the research that I've done for this is pointing the finger at those informal pathways that that long quote that I read out was really highlighting, and the expense of training in tech skills. So I think one of the things that's really exciting to think about for the future is the use of apprenticeships. Priel and I are talking to a couple of apprenticeship providers at the moment, and yeah, I'm really excited about working with them next year to bring on some apprentices. So there we go. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. I hope that's been a different perspective on diversity and inclusion, and giving you some idea of what's unique about the tech industry's challenges. But as we've seen, there's so much in common with all of the other of all of the other departments, all of the other aspects of industry, because at the end of the day, you know, it's humans